Most of us are familiar with the traditions of scary stories. Usually while gathered around a campfire, people will swap spooky tales about things that go bump in the night. These deliciously frightful stories were just enough to scare you without totally pushing you over the edge. But what happens when scary stuff starts happening in real life? Tonight I've gathered some real-life horror stories from the internet. So, whether you prefer paranormal activity or tales of adventurers who barely escape death's grasp, these real horror stories will make your skin crawl, and at the very least, rob you of some much-deserved, if not all, sleep. So dim the lights, curl up under your favorite blanket, and let's begin. Number 1. We moved into a new house a few months ago. As we were in the process of purchasing the new house, the renter who was living in it died unexpectedly of natural causes in his mid-40s. He died right in the middle of the living room. Shortly after, we moved into the house, and almost immediately, our 2-year-old daughter starts talking about the ghost that lives in our house. Now, let's be real here. She's 2, and 2-year-olds are very impressionable. Halloween had recently passed, and she had this Halloween-themed picture book that she loved to read. So it's entirely possible that all this talk of ghosts was just coming from looking through this book on a regular basis. Still, she was always telling me that the ghost was in her playhouse in the basement, or that the ghost was on the stairs, or that the ghost was standing in the corner. She never seemed to be afraid of the ghost, and considered him to be her friend, so I wasn't at all concerned, even if there really was a ghost haunting our house. If he's a nice and helpful ghost, it could certainly be a lot worse. I would often tell the ghost that he was welcome to stay if he wanted to, but he was also welcome to go if that would make him happier. I was about 30-70 on the ghost being real, and she could see and talk to him, versus the ghost being just her imagination, fueled by her Halloween book. Until one day, when we were going out to the car to go to daycare in the morning. It was still dark out and raining. My daughter told me that the ghost was on the back deck, and then she told me that day was the ghost's birthday, and she wanted to sing him happy birthday. Once again, I mostly disregarded what she was saying, as she is birthday obsessed and has in the past made us sing happy birthday to Mickey Mouse, a bowl of fruit snacks, and the bathroom. So we sang and wished the ghost a happy birthday and went on with our lives. Later that day, out of pure curiosity, I looked up the obituary of the man who had died in our house. And wouldn't you know it, it was his frickin' birthday. Number 2. A few years ago, I was living in a fairly nice apartment complex. I was having a cigarette on my balcony around 3 a.m. on a Tuesday night. I'm usually on my phone, but I got this weird chill and looked up to see a middle-aged man walking down the sidewalk across the complex. It struck me that he did not belong here, and I realized he wasn't one of the residents. As I was thinking this, he suddenly stopped and looked right at me, making eerie, way too long eye contact, and then rushed off between the buildings in the opposite direction of the apartment. I told my husband about it, and I joked that if we get a knock on our door in the next 15 minutes, we can assume it's that creeper. Oh my gosh, sure as crap, 10 minutes later, there's this quiet, faint tap, tap, tap on our door. My eyes probably popped out of my head, and my husband jumped up to grab his gun from the other room. I slowly walk up to the door to look through the peephole, holding my breath, and there was the man I had seen looking right at me through the peephole. I know he wasn't able to actually see me, but the image of him looking right into my eye still freaks me out to this day. My husband walked up to the door, staring through the peephole, and shouted, "What?" in this threatening voice. Apparently the man had his hand on the doorknob and jerked back in surprise to hear a man's voice. Dude asked for Jeremy or some made-up name, and my husband told him to leave. After BSing a little longer, the guy finally walked downstairs, only to peer up into the living room window from the lawn. I closed the blinds, and he moved over to stare at me through the balcony door. He didn't move on until after I shut that one too. We called security and gave a clear description and everything. A few days later, we got a report from our complex that an apartment had been robbed around the same time that night. What keeps me up at night is this question. If you're going to rob an apartment, why would you go to one that you definitely know a woman is awake and home, seemingly alone at? Number 3. My bedroom is on the second floor of the house. There's no patio, porch, or overhang of any kind beneath my windows. A couple of years ago, I was watching TV in bed around 2 a.m. and heard a louder than usual animal sound. Not uncommon to hear squirrels running around on the roof from time to time. Didn't think much of it, but it kept on happening, and it started to sound awfully close to the window and not on the roof. I ignored it for a pretty long time. After at least 40 to 45 minutes of being irritated by the noise, I banged on the wall in hopes that this would scare them off so I could get some sleep. Just 2 quick bangs with my fist, which were answered with 2 bangs on the wall right next to the window from outside. Needless to say, I just about crapped and jumped out of bed. Now, my living room has a bay window and is on the other end of the house, so I could look out that window from the side and see my bedroom window. I hustled downstairs and peeked out. I see a guy standing in front of my house, below my bedroom window. He's got a knife, a small pocket knife, in his hand, and he's petting the front of my house. So I call the police and wait. He never leaves the front of the house, even when they roll up and ultimately disarm and arrest him without much struggle. Number 4. I lived in an apartment a few years ago. 4 units upstairs, 4 units downstairs. I lived upstairs, and the apartment below me was vacant. I kept hearing footsteps through the apartment, and I knew I shouldn't have. Nobody was downstairs. I asked someone to come over and listen, just to see if I was going crazy. Maybe I'm just hearing other apartments since it's empty downstairs and everything was echoing. Wrong. I kept hearing the footsteps. This went on for a solid hour. Finally, I called the landlord and the police. Apparently, someone had broken in through the windows downstairs and was walking back and forth through the apartment with a knife. Frickin' horrifying. Number 5. I once woke up with the outline of a handprint on my chest. I measured it, and it was way too large to be my handprint, and way too small to be my husband's hand. Number 6. I was out in the middle of nowhere at a musical conference. My husband was presenting, held at an old church retreat camp. One of his presentations ran way over, so the lodge's cafeteria was closed, with no car, no phone, and this area was so remote there was no coverage for mobile, and no vending machines. The only resort was to walk into the nearest town and get food. I grabbed a coat and a flashlight and had no issues on the trip down and snagged a pizza from a spot along the highway around midnight. On the way back, it was a different story. I got a severe feeling of discomfort. I could feel eyes on me. This was out in the middle of the woods, so my first instinct is there is an animal following me. Knowing most predators like to hit from either above or behind, I turned on my phone light and kept it pointed behind me and swept my flashlight up and down as I walked. The whole walk back I heard rustling, first along one side, then following behind. I kept a steady pace and acted cool, even though I was freaking out. Shortly before I was back on site, the feeling left, no more sounds. My husband and I enjoyed the pizza and slept in. 2 days later, we got a shock from the news. A homeless woman was found less than 1,500 yards from our site that had been mauled and partially consumed in what appears to be a cougar attack. Estimates of the time of death were the same night I went out for pizza. Number 7. Occasionally, I get mild bouts of insomnia, but nothing serious. Usually just a delay in my bedtime of exactly 2 or 3 hours. One night, I suddenly just cannot sleep. Nothing could get me to relax, and I eventually gave up and just sat in the front room playing Heavy Rain all night, as it had just come out a few weeks ago. The next day, when I headed off to work exhausted with 0 hours of sleep, I get a text from my roommate. "Dude, the police are all over the apartment complex." Apparently, 9 apartments, including our downstairs neighbor, were broken into last night, with people home sleeping. Some people even reported things being stolen from rooms they were sleeping in. It hit me that if I had not stayed up all night and left the light on in the front room, I would have been robbed, or worse. Number 8. I drove past a car on my way to class. I was going to college at the time. I always took the back roads to avoid traffic, so I thought it was a bit odd to have a car parked on the side of the road. When I came back from class, it was still there. I drove by a bit more slowly and saw what I thought was someone sleeping in there. I thought that was odder still, but maybe someone was traveling and decided to pull off and take a rest and just fell asleep longer than they planned? Nope. Next morning, I read in the paper, a wife killed her husband and dumped his body and the car on that back road. Number 9. All of the alarms in my house went off at exactly midnight. Then later in the night, all of the phones in my house began to ring at exactly 3 a.m. I watched The Babadook the day before with my boyfriend, and needless to say, I was freaked out. Number 10. A few days ago, my iPhone would not accept my fingerprint for Touch ID, any of my fingerprints. My dog stayed on the other side of the apartment from me and wouldn't take any treats from me. I trained him not to take treats from anyone except me, to avoid poisoning or illness, but he wouldn't even take his favorite treats from me or cuddle with me. When I went to hug him, he hid in his kennel. The PIN didn't work for my debit card, so I ended up having to run it as a credit. I used the same PIN for everything. The only websites I could get into were Reddit, Gmail, and Amazon. Pages where my password was stored. Any websites where I had to enter the username and password, it came back as incorrect. Thank goodness there's no password to wake my computer up, or I wouldn't have been able to do any work that day. The next day, everything was back to normal. Number 11. My great-aunt died in August 2012. 6 months later, February 2013, my cousin was playing in a hockey tournament. He was extremely close to our aunt and was pretty devastated by the loss. His team was never that good. However, in this particular tournament, they were doing really well. They ended up making it to the finals. They lost, but that's where fate comes into play. All of the runner-up trophies were wrapped in newspaper. My cousin pulled a trophy out of the box, and the single piece of paper wrapped around it was my aunt's obituary from 6 months earlier. Number 12. Working as a 911 dispatcher, I got a call from a house. I called it back, and it had been disconnected. This is actually fairly common and happened whenever it rained. The backstory on the house is that it was vacant and used to have an active landline. The theory was that water was somehow getting into the telephone system to the house and was setting off false alarms. Well, we get one, and I thought about just saying, "Up yours," but I stuck with the protocol and sent an officer. The vacant house had just caught on fire the day after a rainstorm, never found a witness, and the house was saved. Number 13. It was winter break, freshman year of college. I drove up to visit one of my friends in northwestern Pennsylvania for New Year's. I needed to be back home the next day for work, so I decided to drive back at like 2 a.m. I was driving down Interstate 79, and I maybe saw 2 cars in a 60-mile span. I come up around a bend and saw what looked like a black bear in my lane, so I swerved and went off the road and crashed into a tree line next to the highway. I was in the middle of nowhere, and the bear just booked it into the woods. My car was completely totaled, and I knew I wasn't going to see any cars for hours to help me out. I called 911, and they said they would come in like 20 minutes. I got out of the car and stood up on the shoulder of the highway and waited. After about 5 minutes, I heard some rustling in the bushes, and there it was. The frickin' bear! Turns out, when I went off the road, I hit its cub. Mama Bear was mad as heck. I booked it over to the back of the car and hopped in the trunk. Thank goodness I had a big Ford Expedition, so the bear couldn't mess with it too much. For another half an hour, the bear tried ramming the car and was trying to get at me in a frenzy. The police showed up, and the siren scared Mama Bear off into the woods again. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. Number 14. When I was in 5th grade, some guy who was mentally ill had a meltdown somewhere in Chicago. Apparently, he shot and killed some random guy and stole his car. He drove up I-94 towards my suburb, got off the highway, and drove straight into my neighborhood. It's very close to the exit, and just started shooting sporadically at people's houses. He somehow wound up in my backyard, which is full of trees, and was just shooting in every direction. I can still vividly remember brake lights in the middle of the otherwise pitch black woods and sparks from the gunfire going off in every direction. The cops show up and shot him to death. Luckily no one was hurt, but my neighbors did find bullets in the middle of their mattress. Fireworks are not so much fun anymore. Number 15. I grew up in a forestry cottage, miles away from any town. We often got toads and birds and other woodland creatures in the house, out of the blue. I was 7 at the time and suffered from night terrors. My parents often found me about the house at night, speaking nonsense or screaming. Must have freaked them out to no end. For a few nights, I've been shouting at my parents, convinced there was something in my bed. I couldn't sleep because of it, but obviously my parents put it down to my nightmares. I kept saying something was shaking in my bed and scratching me. They took all my blankets and toys out to show me there was nothing there, but I was still convinced. I was an odd child, so people often thought I was making things up. Turns out, a bat had gotten into the duvet cover. I opened it up one night, and this thing flew out. Parents ran in and turned the lights on to find this bat dinging around the room. Sometimes I still wake up to this feeling that there's a bat in my blanket. Number 16. I know you're gonna laugh, And I know it probably sounds a little funny, but this was probably the most scariest thing that ever happened to me. I was a little kid, I was maybe 6, and I woke up to a rat eating my cousin's eyebrows while we were sharing a bed. Needless to say, I still don't sleep good. Alright, my lovely lilies, thank you so much for watching the new video. If you can, hit that subscribe and like button, comment below and tell me your thoughts. Also, don't forget to tap the little notification bell so you're always in the know on this channel. As well, guys, you can always find me on Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and always you can hit me up in my emails. Feel free to send me your stories, whether they're fiction or totally true. I'm always up for some great stories. And oh, by the way, until next time, sweet dreams.